morning, everyone. Sorry I couldn't be with you physically. We will be launching this morning discussion by looking at the notion of illiberalism. So it has some links with what has been happening in Russia, because Russia probably led the rise of illiberalism. But today we'll be mostly looking at what is happening in the so-called liberal democratic world, so mostly looking at the West and having with you a kind of general discussion about that notion of illiberalism and how it is helping us conceptualizing, analyzing what is happening now. So let me begin by just some few remarks on this notion of illiberalism. It seems to be a new concept, but in fact it was already existing since late 19th century at the combination of something that is not entirely anti-liberal, and we can discuss the relationship between being illiberal and being anti-liberal. But as you can see, it was already mentioned but in English political culture in late 19th century, and then it became a very famous term used to describe regimes that are kind of democratic in the sense that they have a competitive election, but which are not liberal in their political ideology. And that's the way Fareed Zakaria used the term in 1997 to describe mostly Latin American country and parts of the post-socialist or post-communist world. And then in 2014, it was taken by Orban himself as something that he wanted to be proud of, right? A terminology, liberal democracy, that he wanted to promote as a way to promote himself and his regime in Hungary. So what you can see with this notion is that it's both what we call emic and ethic. It's both used by political actors themselves as something they want to qualify themselves, and it's used as an analytical category by scholars to describe some political or cultural direction. And it's also used as a kind of political insult, right? If you say to someone, well, he's totally liberal, he's an illiberal politician, you kind of already categorize. So you can see the term is very loaded because he exists both in the scholarly frame and also in the kind of real political discourse by actors themselves. It's also interesting to notice how the terms emerge as an adjective, illiberal, and gradually became a noun, like illiberalism. And so it's all the question about, is there an ideology around illiberalisms, and is the isms at the end kind of legitimate? And in that case, what is this ideology? So let me look first at the academic space of the terms, right? It is overlapping with different notions that already exist that have a very large body of literature, like populism, conservatism, and authoritarianism. And so there are kind of current discussion in academia about what does illiberalism bring to the discussion, and what are the boundaries between illiberalism and populism, conservatism, authoritarianism, or also, of course, far right. So all these elements, they are still in tension. There is no agreement in the academic community. There is a growing discussion about how to dissociate illiberalism and authoritarianism, which is more a regime category, while liberalism wants to capture the more kind of ideological texture of a regime. And you can have authoritarian regime which don't have a very clearly elaborated illiberal ideology, and some that really try to articulate both. You also have kind of gaps and overlaps with populism. I think one of the key elements of the differences is the relationship between people and the elites, which is really the core element of populism. If you look at illiberalism as an ideological production, it's not necessarily anti-elitist, anti-intellectualist. It doesn't necessarily lead a charismatic leader. So here you may have some gaps between the two notions. And also, I think there is a global view in the academic community that the concept of populism has become so inflated, covering so many things, that in a sense it's kind of lost its conceptual meaning, and illiberalism has come to kind of partly replace some of the current discussion. And then there is, of course, the relationship between illiberalism and conservatism. And here I think it's really something that is getting explored right now with several scholars looking at that. And one of the difficulties in articulating both terminology is that conservatism itself is a very broad term with very different definition depending on the cultural space. If you look at more kind of Anglo-Saxon tradition of conservatism, it was economically liberal, while illiberalism today, at least in the narratives of illiberal leaders, is not very economically liberal. It tends to be protectionist, statist, in favor of the welfare state. Doesn't mean that they do that in their own political economy, but that's there is something around the relationship to economy that is dissociating illiberalism as we see it in many regimes now, and kind of Anglo-Saxon conservatism. But if you look at a more kind of European continental conservatism where the state is very important, then it can fit better with illiberalism. And also globally in the post-World War, Second World War, parties that were presenting themselves as conservative, it can be the Republican Party in the US, it can be the democratic kind of social democracy, conservatism, German type, were not challenging liberal democracy principle, right? They were part of it in a kind of balance game with social democracy. And so what illiberalism is bringing now is that suddenly the commitment to liberal democratic principle seems to be kind of fading on some part of the conservative right. You can see the tension inside the Republican Party in the US. You can see also, for example, in Germany, the tensions between Christian Democrats and more kind of far-right party. You have the same in France in the tension between the classic mainstream right and the National Front or National Rally, as it's called now, of Marine Le Pen. So you see there is some overlap and some gaps in the way the concept of illiberalism is emerging and is in dialogue with other notions. I show you now two of the kind of preliminary definitions that have been given of illiberalism. The first one is from the Routledge Handbook of Illiberalism that was published almost 2 years ago, defining illiberalism as the set of phenomena associating with the waning of individual liberty and as an everyday experience. I like that notion because it's very much, it's tried to capture the grassroots aspect, the individual aspect of illiberalism, and I will come back on that. And then another notion, which is another definition, which is the one we are working on, which is kind of still preliminary, and that will be framed in the context of the Oxford Handbook of Illiberalism that will be published in a few months, where we define illiberalism as a kind of ideological universe, right? It has it's context-based, it's situational, it can evolve, it's doctrinally fluid, but still you can identify some degree of coherence. And the way we define it, it's as a backlash of today's liberalism in its different definition, and I will come back on that. And the solution, I think it's very important to identify the illiberalism, not only something that is backlashing, right? It also comes with solution. We may like it or not, that's another question, but it comes with solutions that are majoritarian, sovereignist, in favor of traditional hierarchy, and that called for some form of cultural homogeneity. And here you can also identify more radical, like more close to the far right, illiberalisms, some that are more kind of faded, that are more kind of adapted to the mainstream. And so we are working on this current definition, and you will see the way I will articulate them in the relationship with liberalism. Last global slide on illiberalism. How can we use it if it's a very broad term, right? You have it in Western established democracy. You can find it in the global South. The terms really emerge, and that's what I was saying at the beginning, mentioning Zakaria. It's emerged to describe Latin America and post-socialist country, and then it's really became very trendy in kind of media and policy world to really describe Russia, Turkey's Turkey evolution under Erdogan, potentially some Western established democracy, and then with Trump election in 2016, it's really kind of jumped as a term widely used in the media. So you can see there are also here some tension about like defining it as specific to some country that had a very specific evolution, shifting from autocratic regime to more democracy and then kind of backlashing. Case of Russia, case of Turkey. We can discuss if China is part of that trend, and illiberalism as arriving in kind of Western established liberal democracy. So it's a global phenomenon. At the same time, it has each time a very context-based, like cultural and political specificities. It's also telling us how much things are getting globalized, right? You have transnational connection between peoples, ideas, funders. Look at, for example, the CPAC, the conservative conference organized by American Conservative, which is now traveling all over the world and creating connection. They were a few months ago in Budapest with Orban. And then one element is to look at the kind of geographical space of illiberalism, but also at its kind of historical, right? The diachronic aspect. Do we want to consider illiberalism as something that has emerged, let's say, in the last half a century? Or do we want to use illiberalism to also describe, for example, Weimar Republic and maybe even going back earlier in time? And how do we manage that kind of chronological tension? So you see, the concept is still on its way to be kind of articulated. What I would like to launch as a discussion today is more the entanglement between liberalism and illiberalism, because I think it will really overlap a lot with the discussion you will have during the conferences about character assassination, illiberalism, erosion of civic rights, which is that illiberalism is always situational and it's always a response to liberalism, but that liberalism is also very plural, right? You have many ways of being liberal. First, as you know, and many of you are historians, liberalism and democracy not always went together, right? We have kind of conflated them now, but it's a very post-Second World War conflation. For very long, liberalism was even kind of contrary to democracy, at least that's the way liberals in 18th century were considering sometimes democracy as a danger because it was the power of the crowd, of the mass, while liberalism of kind of political passions, while liberalism was the more kind of the moderation, the art of moderation in politics. And then also you have many ways of describing liberalism, right? When we say we are liberal or we live in liberal democracy country, what do we mean by liberalism? Is that the political liberalism, which is usually about individual rights? But here also, even if you try to disentangle that political liberalism, you have a lot of possible notions. It can be insisting on individual rights, it can be insisting on universal rights, it can be a faith in progress, it can be faith in science and rationality. That's the more kind of enlightenment aspect of political liberalism. We can be talking about political, economic liberalism, which is a totally different aspect. We can be talking about cultural liberalism, right? Or emancipation of social hierarchy and tradition in terms of gender rights, homosexuality, and so on, which is something that has been very critical now on the way illiberalism is rising, really kind of focusing on culture war. It can be a geopolitical liberalism that is getting challenged, for example, by Russia or by China, or it can be a colonial liberalism. If you look at all the literature coming from the global south on post-coloniality, a lot of things are about liberalism was colonial or is still colonial toward the non-Western world. So you can see there is a plurality of liberalism and therefore a plurality of illiberalisms that are emerging as an answer to it. And then there are many entanglements, and I think that's something really interesting to try to dig more in, because it's giving us some more granular perception of what is happening in our own kind of Western societies, right? Because the literature tend to say liberals are the others, you know, our kind of enemy, those who are outside the liberal democratic framework. When you look, for example, at what is happening currently in Europe, you can see you can have illiberal politicians functioning in a liberal system. In France, in Italy, in Spain, in Germany, you had a far-right party in government in Austria a few years ago before COVID. So how do we want to think that permanent tension? Can illiberal politicians function in a liberal system, and are they destroying it? right? And I think the current interest in from the policy and academic community in looking at what is happening in Italy to see if Meloni's government will be deconstructing Italian democracy is an interesting example on how we look at that tension. And maybe liberal democracy survived pretty well having a liberal leader in power, right? Look at the US after Trump. So how do we look at what it means to have a liberal leader sometime in government or in presidency, and how the liberal democratic institution have enough power and strength to kind of rebalance afterward or against the illiberal leader. So that's one kind of entanglement. A second one is that even in liberal democratic regimes or government, you can identify illiberal public policy, right? There are always places of tensions where liberal government themselves tend to practice illiberal public policy. And it's usually on everything that is related to security and to privacy broadly. If you look in details on refugees and migrant policy of the European Union, you could identify many of them as illiberal, right? Not showing full commitment to what liberalism should be. If you look at counterterrorism, beginning with the war on terror in the US and how it was a breach on many liberal values, including privacy, on how it has been growing in Europe, you can also see that around counterterrorism, you have very deep kind of contradiction inside a liberal political system about to which point are we liberal against or toward the anti-liberal forces. And then more globally, if you look at in terms of European or US public opinion, you can identify, right, pocket of the population or pocket of feeling inside one individual that are often like that can be identified as illiberal, right? People, if you look, for example, at surveys done in Europe after a big terrorist attacks, you will find a certain kind of need for security, you know, fear of other, wanted to have a kind of identity retreat. So all these elements, they are part of a liberal system. They are part of the kind of intrinsic tension that you have inside liberalism, both at the level of the government and at the level of just individuals who may be very committed to liberal democracy globally, but we may also have some fears in themselves toward which they have to work, right, in not having them too much kind of political weight. So that's another aspect of this entanglement. The third one, which I think is a very deep one, is that there is a liberal democratic fatigue. I think both the liberal democratic institution as we have them, especially in Europe, and the need of a large part of the population are kind of clashing. And what we see authoritarian practices arriving from liberal democratic governments, kind of clashing with the grassroots need for belief in a democracy that wouldn't be the classic representative democracy that many people feel like as if is not functioning anymore, but that would be a much more participative democracy. And I put there just a photo of the protests we had in France a few weeks ago against the pension reform, where you really had a clash between the Macron government trying to enforce against the parliament a law that they consider needed for reforming the country and moving it forward, and people reacting with a kind of very participative democracy claim, and the two kind of clashing. And we see that also when we look at the global surveys done in terms of for European public opinion, where we see a growth of the number of European citizens who ask for an authoritarian leader. Not that they believe in authoritarianism, but that they have the feeling that the only way to get efficiency from the state and to be able to reform our societies is to have someone who is given extra democratic power. And so you can see this kind of doubts about how the representative democracy is functioning, I think is very deep and is really challenging the way we tend to define liberal democracy. And we see leaders like now Emmanuel Macron acting in a much more authoritarian ways and clashing with the population, which is asking for another form of democracy. And then last points on this kind of entanglement is all the discussion that is really getting more and more important in the literature about either also an undemocratic liberalism. Can we consider that some EU institution, in particular the Commission, the European Commission, which is not elected, which is a technocratic body, is implementing an economic neoliberalism that is largely undemocratic? What are the role of lobbies, for example, in decision-making at the European level? How should we consider neoliberalism as being politically illiberal, that is at deconstructing what is the share kind of common goods that people share inside a citizenry, and how do we want to articulate illiberalism and neoliberalism? So all these kind of discussions are currently underway in the literature, and I think they are really bringing fascinating elements into our discussions. Just a few more slides before concluding on the systemic reasons for this entanglement and the kind of challenges that we see emerging to mainstream liberalism in Europe and in the US, which I think is really telling us a lot about how our societies are evolving. So it's really kind of structural transformation that are happening. The first one, and it's a kind of obvious one, is that you always had a gap between liberalism as a philosophy or as the kind of archaic type of regime, and liberalism as a lived experience by citizens in our current world. And this idea that liberalism failed at delivering its promises, especially in relation to equality or equity. And so all these questions, they were very traditional for all those challenging liberalism. These challenges can come from the right and from the left. And of course, the left has been really challenging like technocratic mainstream liberalism in terms of its lack of strategies for equality and equity, but you have also criticism coming from the right. And then I think globally, there is this growing feeling that democratic mechanisms are too opaque, right? That it's very difficult for citizens to understand how they work. And that the space where politics can be acting is in fact shrinking. So we ask citizens to continue to believe in a political system where the capacity of the system to change the world is in fact shrinking. And I think it's all the discussion about how politics can retake control of the private sector, of big corporations that are kind of leading on so many aspects of our lives. So here also you have a core, really kind of political discussion that is going on. Another one, and here also a lot of research has been done that are really fascinating about how the acceleration of time in which we are living, the fact that we have internet, social media, that we want immediacy in everything, is kind of contradicting with the fact that democracy is slow. If you want decision to be taken by listening to all the different aspects and having a kind of compromise, it takes time. And so there is this kind of contradiction where we are asked to live and to act in a very immediate way. But we have to believe that democracy has to be slow to be really itself. And so here also, I think that explains part of the kind of the disillusion of some part of the European constituencies toward liberal democracy. Another key element, which many of you will be discussing during the conference, is the role of media ecosystem in promoting illiberalism, right? And I think here we have really a large research, body of research that has been done in showing how the privatization of media ecosystem, the clickbait culture, the kind of the commercial aspect of all media ecosystem, not only social media, but also traditional media, is pushing toward illiberal position. It's giving the floor to illiberal leaders. It likes clashes of position. It likes incivilities. It doesn't want compromise. And so media are playing a key role in kind of accelerating the disappearance of a feeling of a collective good. And I know many of you will be looking at that aspect during the conferences, because that's where character assassination and illiberalism are kind of encountering each other. And then globally, we have a kind of, we live in a time of extreme individualization of politics, right? We are asked to explain everything by our own feelings, right? To have everything situated in individuals. And so that is also giving or helping the kind of post-truth ideology to develop with this idea that if we are entirely focused on emotion and affect, then it's very difficult to continue to share things in common, right? Everything becomes so polarized and everything becomes a kind of culture war where arguments are utilized in a very moralizing way and in a very individualistic way, kind of like, it's my belief, so you cannot challenge it, right? So all these very deep transformation of our societies are kind of explaining these entanglements between liberalism and illiberalism as we see it now. And then briefly to conclude before opening the floor for some discussion, I think one of the key really underlying elements of the current discussion is the tension we have in defining what is progress, right? For previous generation, progress was pretty obvious, and kind of technological progress was seen for very long as bringing progress to the individual. Now we can see that both in terms of technologies, and all the discussion about artificial intelligence is a good example of that, and the issue of environment and climate change is showing us that, well, not everything that looks like progress is necessarily progress politically or in terms of individual right. And so how do we disentangle that, and how liberalism, which always believed in progress, is discussing the kind of illiberalism emerging from a technological progress and from a relationship to climate change. So it's all about what are the responsibilities of big corporations, how can they be included into the kind of the democratic oversight that is needed to have a liberal democratic system, how technologies and media ecosystem are kind of challenging our vision of what it means to be living together, I think are really one of the leading venue for current research. Maybe more politically or more politicized, there is a growing discussion, especially among the more kind of leftist part of the literature, about how do we try to rescue political liberalism from the failure of neoliberalism, right? How do we reinvent this kind of togetherness? And here you can see answer coming from the right and answer coming from the left, challenging the same elements of the liberal democratic system, but with two different sets of answer. Something that I think is key for those of us studying illiberalism is how we dissociate the political opportunistic construction and the genuine grassroots grievances, right? How do we hear those, for example, who are voting for Trump from Trump's own strategy? Or the same, how do we dissociate the Orban regime and its kind of nepotism, kleptocratic strategy from the grassroots grievances that people are expressing, and how do we try to articulate but also disarticulate them so we can hear the grievances while fighting against the political construction? And then last point about the fact that I think we are now, and I think there is a broad agreement in the literature now, that we are returning to a time where politics is conflictual, it's a rebellion. And so I think it's important in the current discussion on liberalism and illiberalism to understand that the kind of a very uniformized politics as we had it in the Western world, this time is closed. It was the post-Second World War time. It existed for half a century. And now we are coming back to a moment where politics will be, for probably long, very conflictual until new mechanisms emerge to help solving the tension we can notice in our own society. So I will be stopping here. I really look forward to the discussion and happy to answer all your questions and comments. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much. I really think you set the landscape for a really interesting discussion. Like maybe to hit off, how would you place what a lot of like illiberal, like a lot of people who would be considered as illiberal speak about globalism. Like how do you fit this work in into the whole discussion about illiberalism?
Yeah, I think a big part of the grievances expressed by people who present themselves as illiberal or who share some illiberal values is about the failure of globalism or globalization. It's usually understood mostly either in terms of culture war, right? The globalization of some progressive values kind of perceived as imposed from the Western European centering perspective to the rest of the world, or it's about economic globalization. Of course, you always have several layers of reading, right? You can also, if for scholars who, for example, have been working on the far right, for them, this anti-globalization narrative is very much a kind of softened or smoothened version of very old conspiracy theory, for example, about Jewish dominancy, right? And would say that, well, it's all a new way when you say you anti-globalized elite or cosmopolitan elites. It's a kind of indirect way of reactivating the kind of very old conspiracy theory about kind of Jews dominating the world and so on. So I think you have different elements of reading, and that's where it's important to have different scholars from different disciplines, those bringing this kind of historical perspective, those listening to the grievances, right? To the fact that people interpret globalization as something that is making them losing their own identity. But here also you have a rich literature that is telling us that you don't have globalization without having rootness, right? You always have a balancing moment where the more you get globalized, the more you are in need of valuing or at least identifying some roots, right? And I think here also that the tension about asking citizens to be globalized and asking them at the same time to be local, that is intention. And then you can also look at it in a more sociological perspective, looking at how blue-collar classes are in much more difficulties in getting globalized and are living in economic reality that are much more localized and less globalized than if you are white-collar, like highly educated citizen. So I think there are several elements to kind of look at on that question of globalization.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed your bit about systemic reasons and myself working on liberalism and illiberalism. So a few points. Firstly, I work on comparative political theory, and it always is kind of it jumps out to me that how even when you're talking about liberalism, it is in a way a bit Eurocentric in my view, the definition, for instance. And I'm going to link it to my larger question that I'm not really convinced that liberalism is an ideology, even in the sense like of Frieden's understanding of thin ideology. I don't think I'm convinced with that. So I'm going to give reasons as to why I think that. Firstly, even when you use it, illiberalism, and you use the literature on varieties of liberal scripts. I was myself part of the liberal scripts project, and they use the word scripts and not liberalism exactly for this reason, because there are so many varieties of liberalism per se that it's very difficult to understand it as an ideology. So that is one. Secondly, I said that I found your definition very Eurocentric, and I'll give you the reason why. Colonized worlds, non-Western societies have forever been told that they are not anti-liberal, non-liberal, right? That liberalism never was fully realized there. Why? Because non-liberal, non-Western societies like India thought about liberalism not in terms of individual rights, but also in terms of group rights. So the idea of group rights is missing from your definition, which is a very nuanced and good definition. But I would suggest that maybe you think more deeply about including the idea of group rights in it. And lastly, I think that while you're defining liberalism as opposed to illiberalism, contrasting it, I think it would be also very fruitful if you think about liberalism as opposed to non-liberal. So that is not illiberal, that is not anti-liberal. So for instance, the language of social justice in Marxism, for instance, right? So what I'm trying to say is that sometimes non-liberal discourses come together with illiberal discourses to justify the illiberal discourse, right? Ideas of social justice, where the rights-based language is completely missing. So I was wondering, and I was thinking that maybe you can think about in these lines where you talk about non-liberal discourse as opposed to a liberal discourse, which is a discourse about rights, which is a rights-based discourse, both individual and collective. And I would really suggest that you should look into some literature in non-Western political thought who talk about liberalism and the critique of liberalism and looking at liberalism from a non-Western perspective. I really suggest that you look at Partha Chatterjee's book. It's called The Politics of the Governed. I really suggest that you have a quick look at that, and because it does talk about how liberalism is practiced in most part of the world, which is the non-Western part of the world. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
I give you the opportunity to react.
Yeah, no, that's all great points. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed all this kind of feedback, and totally agree about the group's right. I think I had it implicitly under the notion of sovereignty, but I agree that group rights per se should be kind of framed, and everything around social justice, I think, is indeed a very important element, because you can see it coming from like currently challenging liberalism both from the right and from the left, right, with different probably definition of what is social justice, but it's indeed a very kind of key element. And all the discussion about non-liberal, I would also add there is now an interesting discussion about just liberalism, right, just not belonging to that liberal, non-liberal, illiberal world, but just being liberal, right, functioning with a kind of a value system that is different from and that which doesn't necessarily refer or take a position toward liberalism. And totally agree on the fact that the majority of the literature is really Western centric, and that we totally miss a large part of the global south. And I had it very briefly mentioned, but I agree it should be kind of more prominent, in that the global south literature has been thinking about liberalism as a kind of colonial practice since decades before it was suddenly kind of rediscovered very recently in the West. So thank you so much for all these comments. I think it's giving us great kind of elements on how the discussion is very fruitful.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah.
Hi, Marlène. Thank you so much. That was very interesting. It provides a lot of food of thought. And I was just wondering if you would be so kind to elaborate perhaps on how you see neoliberalism and illiberalism standing together, because I'll qualify my question here. We see neoliberalism spreading more and more in our societies, not just in political agendas and policies, but also at a micro level, almost in, you know, what people want is freedom of choice, freedom of opinion, and seeing the individual as a project, you know, with all the responsibility that comes with that. But anyway, so this neoliberalism very clear, but that all seems to, this freedom of choice and stuff, even no matter how empty, seems to stand contrary to the idea of what you mentioned of wanting an autocratic leader, and also to what's it, Sayeux et al.'s definition, which you proffered, of waning of individual liberty. So I thought, wow, that's really interesting. It seems a bit contrary to me. Would you be able to elaborate on how those two work together, neoliberalism, liberalism?
Yeah, thank you so much. Also, great points. Depends on the literature. If you look at the kind of restrictive definition of neoliberalism only at the economic level, right? I think the literature would say that this kind of economic neoliberalism is contributing to political illiberalism, because it's kind of putting groups of people, of citizens, different social classes fighting with each other for whatever remain of the welfare state, and kind of accelerating the feeling that you have to fight with each other for limited availability of public support. But I think what you are raising is much more important, which is neoliberalism at the global, much more holistic philosophy, which is all about kind of individual rights. And so a philosophy of the individual up to an extreme level that we have now, about the freedom to decide for everything, including a core element of identity like gender identity. And I agree, I think there is a tension between this kind of celebration of extreme individualism and what people need to feel they believe to a society, right? Because once you deconstruct the traditional social hierarchy, the family, the gender identity, right, the belonging to some social groups, and you put on individuals the responsibility to decide for everything of who they are in their life, which is a very heavy, like a responsibility put on the shoulder of people, that creates a tension to know what do we share together, right? Why are we living together? What are the boundaries that make us accepting to live together and share some of our elements? So I think the question is how this kind of philosophical neoliberalism is in fact deconstructing the notion of common goods. And how do we want to have that functioning? And I think citizens feel that kind of contradiction maybe intuitively when they are at the same time, right, claiming more individual rights and at the same time still wanted to have a political system that is efficient. To be efficient, it needs to share some kind of, it needs to have common ground, right? And I think that's all the issue, that what are the common grounds? Because philosophical extreme individualism is not enough as a common ground to allow citizens to live together and to allow the state to function. I think a good example we had was the tension during COVID time, right? The fact that you had citizens saying, well, it's my freedom to refuse vaccination, my freedom to take the risk and risk the life of others in not respecting the lockdown. So how a liberal democratic system can impose something which is very private, which is the relationship to my own body, my own safety, my own health, and go against my freedom? And here I think there are very deep tensions that were very difficult for European regimes, European political system, for example, to solve. What that kind of contradiction where they had to come up with a narrative, well, maybe it's go against your individual freedom, but it's good for the collective body. But if you have deconstructed the collective goods, it's very difficult to explain citizens that they should kind of limit their own freedom for the collective part. So I think around COVID, there was really kind of interesting element of that discussion, until which point the individual absolute kind of freedom is clashing with what is considered needed to make the society functioning.
Okay, thank you so much. Is there another question?
There are 2 questions in the chat, I think. Perhaps we can read those as well.
What?
Yeah, I see one very good question also about, is illiberalism an independent phenomenon, or is it a stage of evolution towards, for example, authoritarianism? So that is, I think, an element that has been discussed by the literature that is looking specifically at the relationship between so-called illiberal democracy and authoritarian regime, which is to know if it's a kind of, path. So you have an illiberal leader inside a liberal democracy, kind of Giorgia Meloni in Italy. Then you move to an illiberal democracy, kind of Orban or Poland style, where you still have an opposition. Then you have a trend toward illiberal democracy, Orban style. And then you have kind of Putin's Russia, the kind of extreme move toward authoritarianism. I think you can see, if you look chronologically, you can see some countries evolving from one to the other. And in that case, indeed, illiberalism is only one moment in the history of an evolution of a political regime. And I think for Russia, it works pretty well, that for very long, you could really see Putin's regime as illiberal before becoming so kind of authoritarian that the illiberal definition is maybe not fitting so well anymore. But I don't think it's a predetermined trajectory, right? I think country can go back to a more liberal democratic regime. Look at, for example, Austria. They had a far-right party as part of the government that didn't destroy the Austrian democracy, right? That may be shifting of public policy, that may be shifting political language about, what we accept to say, for example, in terms of migration. But the institutions were strong enough to avoid the shift toward authoritarianism. So I think it's very much depend on the strategies of an illiberal leader to stay in power as long as possible. And then the longer he or she stays, the more the democratic institutions are getting eroded or destroyed, and there it's moving toward an authoritarian regime. Or if you have enough tension and resistance from other part of the political spectrum, civil society or institutional check and balances that are still able to kind of keep the society, the political system in the other way. Look at the US, how the Trump presidency creating tension inside federal institution and how the fight moved, for example, to the justice system. Look at Poland, where the peace is still facing a large political opposition. So I think it's not predetermined, but the longer a liberal leader stays in power, the more chances or no chances it has to move toward an authoritarian regime.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your comments. One point that I wanted to raise was that liberalism is a spectrum. And so what society interprets as being liberal or illiberal may depend on a number of factors, but to give an example of how that works in practice, in the US, there's a very robust constitutional protection for individual rights. In Europe is very proud of its own liberal tradition, but it's quite different. And there is no such, there are no such constitutional protections. So there's a different interpretation of these freedoms. And therein lies a big contradiction, because in the US, there is even a fight within the so-called liberal world, but the legal protections offered by the constitutions kind of help resolve this conundrum between the individual rights and the social group rights, because first of all, they limit the power of the government to be abusive in the event of polarizing social phenomena, such as demagogues coming to power and social polarization and extreme ideas. They limit these ideas, and second, they help navigate even the political factors that lie outside the system. So my question kind of is, given that there's still a lot of differences within the European framework, not to mention outside Europe, democracies that are non-Western, to what extent is adaptation of more constitutional frameworks could help limit, kind of reframe this debate in a more institutionalized direction that helps avoid this constant back and forth and backsliding that really depends on a host of independent factors and can at any time, go in a very extreme direction without those legal protections.
Yeah, great point also. And I totally agree on the fact that you cannot study illiberalism without defining in the society you are studying what is considered as liberalism, right? Because as I said, both are entangled, they are situational. So you need to have a clear definition of what is liberalism in the case studies you have to be able to discuss if there a rise of illiberalism or a backlash. And then on the second point, or the kind of constitutional, right? Yeah, I think that's a key element of the resilience of democracy toward the liberal rise. At the same time, I genuinely believe that it's very much that we should be very grassroots oriented and that we should try to capture the messaging that people are sending when they are voting for a liberal leader. They are saying things that really tells how the system doesn't seem to function to them. But I agree that if you would have a better kind of constitutional structure or more institutionalized check and balances, then the society, then the regime or the structure can resist to a liberal leader longer. And I think we saw that in several Western European countries where the institutions are strong enough to resist, while, for example, in Central Europe, where the institutions were kind of rebuilt after the communist period, they are more fragile and they can get pretty rapidly kind of destroyed or transformed by an illiberal leader. But here I think would be really good to look at Latin America and Asia as kind of example where we can see how constitutional kind of structure help resisting illiberal waves or not, because I think the Global South would be really offering great perspective on that.
Okay, thank you so much.
So there was another question about the impact of globalization and asking if deglobalization or reduction in interdependency among states would be helpful. That's a great question. I think that's a difficult one because it's really depend of each of us kind of perception on how deglobalization would work. But I think, I mean, if you look on some public policy aspect, you can see the deglobalization arriving after COVID, for example, right? The fact that many Western European countries or globally industrialized countries are trying to recreate some industries at home and avoiding being entirely dependent, for example, from Chinese or Indian production in pharmaceutical. You can see some aspect of that deglobalization. Will that be enough to give citizens the feeling that this aspect of the kind of economic deglobalization is protecting them enough? I'm not sure. I think it's very much depend on how the kind of the welfare state is able to kind of survive and reinvent itself in this time. So I think very often deglobalization, it's an argument that is used by illiberal leader. I think in practice, deglobalizing the world can be good for some industrial strategy. I don't know if it's solving the kind of the political doubt that citizens are expressing toward our political, the Western political system. And then there was a kind of sub question about, do we think that there are countries that are more culturally apt to democracy compared to other? No, I don't think so, because that would be a very kind of culturalist perspective. I think you have countries with different political tradition, and so changing the political tradition can be more difficult in some contexts that it is. But I think if you don't have a too strict definition of democracy, but you are ready to accept that there are many ways of being democratic, then I think democracy is possible for everybody.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here with us. I thought it was a really rich expose. You touched upon so many, so many like different dimensions of this concept of illiberalism, which shows that it has all kinds of historical, so much varieties which need to be studied. And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Yes,
and wishing you all a great conference.
So yes, and it was really wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.